Good morning. Welcome to the Austin chapter of Reasons to Believe. Really thankful that you have joined us this morning. If you will, let us open with prayer real quick. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this time that we can get together and we can power up in the truth and your word and knowledge. Today is going to be a very exciting presentation that we're all looking forward to, and hopefully it will be beneficial for all of us in our lives and as we rear our children, and that it will be Christ enlightening, that it will be God enlightening as we consider the points that are presented today. Please be with us as humanity, that we continue to go out and we be that light, we be that beacon unto you, and that we reflect your grace and your goodness, your love and your compassion, especially towards our fellow humans in this very dire time. These things we ask in Jesus' name, amen. So I wasn't able to put this in a slide. We have to turn in the slides a week in advance, and this came to my attention just this week. So in the December 5th issue of World Magazine, at the end of the year, they always have a list of their books of the year. So this issue is always one of my favorite issues. However, in this issue, they had a book that was the science book of the year that's titled Mystery of Life's Origin. And there are several authors for this book. One of those is Dr. Walter Bradley, who is a member of our chapter. And we're hoping that Dr. Bradley is going to speak here again in 2021. But I just wanted to point this out and suggest that you not only get the magazine, but you also get the book, which is called Mystery of Life's Origin. So last month, so thankful to all of our volunteers and officers who filled in on the Tuesday before the meeting. My mother passed away, and we had to scramble and go to Tennessee for the funeral on Saturday, and so I wasn't here, but everything went off without a hitch. Really do appreciate everybody filling in at the last minute, but also really enjoyed seeing Dr. Riddell's presentation on our YouTube channel. After it was finished, it was a really very informational presentation about the International Space Station. Dr. Riddell is a scientist that works at NASA in Houston, and it was extremely informative. So if you missed that, it's still up on our channel, and I would recommend that you take the time to watch that. And so speaking of our RTB channel, this is something new this year that we've been enjoying, and I would encourage you to subscribe to our channel. So you're probably on the channel now watching this, but if you have not subscribed, then please take the time to subscribe, and that way you'll be notified of any future presentations. Now, in the coming months, next month in January, I'm going to give a presentation which will be part one of a part two series, and this is going to be on prayer and miracles. Part one in January is going to be, does prayer work? It's such a simple question. There's only 3 words in that question, but it really hinges on the definition of prayer. What is it, and what does it mean for it to work? And so we're going to be taking a look at many of the scientific prayer studies that have been published in peer-reviewed journals, as well as some other studies. And I hope this is going to be very informative. This is one of the most research presentations I've ever done. I cannot even tell you how much reading I did when it came to the studies and the published reports in peer-reviewed journals in regard to this. And so I'm very much looking forward to delivering it in January. Then in February, we're going to be blessed to have Dr. Hugh Ross speaking. He's not going to be here. We're going to set this up virtually in the same way that we did with J. Werner Wallace in July. But we're very excited to have him speak on his latest book, which is called Weathering Climate Change. And obviously this is something that's really been in the news lately. This is actually going to be a presentation that's celebrating Bob and Peggy Lemon's anniversary. Bob was not aware of this, but Peggy had requested this a year ago, and Dr. Ross was going to be here live, and we were so excited for him to be here live as a surprise for Bob. Bob, I'm sorry that he won't be here, but I tell you what, next month or in February, normally the president gets to ask the first question. I'm going to let Bob ask the first question to Hugh Ross when he speaks in February. So Have a good one ready. All right, and then in March, I'll come back and I'll give part 2 of the presentation. Is it rational to believe in miracles? And we're going to be looking at some events that I believe that naturalism is incapable as a worldview of explaining. And so again, I invite you to come back for that. Now, as far as today is concerned, this is live, and so we are going to attempt to take questions. If you have any questions, please email those in to reasonstbaustin@yahoo.com. If you think of the question, you might go ahead and send in the question. There's going to be a part in the middle of the presentation where Jay, I think, may pause and take some questions. So if you have already sent your question in, then hopefully it can be asked then. If not, we do have people here that are hopefully going to be asking some questions as well. But I do encourage you, if you're watching this live, to please send in those questions and send them in as soon as you think of them so that we can have those questions ready to go, because there is a little bit of a lag between the broadcast and what's going on live here. So today, Jay Medenwaldt, who is a doctoral student at Baylor University, is going to be presenting on the science of sex for apologetics and evangelism. Now, I have long thought that the subject of sex is something that the church, for too many years, has avoided talking about. It's been kind of a taboo subject within the church, and I think that we are paying the price for that as a church, to be candid with you. I think it's something that we need to discuss more openly. It's something that God designed for us, and we should be willing to discuss that. However, again, for whatever reason, people just don't like to talk about it. Another problem within the church, and this is more of a minor issue, but sometimes there's a little bit of anti-intellectualism that can be found in the church. We at Reasons to Believe, really try to counter that. So this is going to be a very controversial topic because it's going to be the science, which sometimes some people really don't like to hear about, the science of sex. So we have barred the doors. We've made sure the deacons can't come in here and stop it. All right? So we are very much looking forward to this. And so at this time, I'll ask Jay to come up and present. If you will, please give Jay a nice round of applause.
Thank you, John. And can you hear me okay? All right. Good. Looks like everything's set up good. So Peter Kraft is a Christian philosopher. Often when I hear him speak, he tells the joke about a philosopher who went to heaven, and instead of enjoying heaven and going to it, he preferred to go to the library and read about and learn about heaven. Okay, and I can assure you that this talk on sex is not going to take place for actually doing the act, but we're going to talk about the bounds on which you should do that. And it's going to be a little different. So it's not going to be kind of a how-to or anything about that, or how to make sex the most enjoyable, although that would be an interesting presentation, I'm sure. It's going to be more about biological sex, which we're going to talk about here kind of in part 1. What is biological sex? And then part 2 is going to talk about the science of sex as far as like monogamy and number of partners and all that, and what the research shows leads to the best outcomes and how that relates to the Christian view of sex. Okay? So with doing that, I am going to give a PG-13 warning, although it's probably more of like a PG-10 or 11. So if you do have young kids or something at home and you're listening or watching, or you're going to watch this, we are going to touch on some things that might be a little sensitive. So I just want to give that little bit of a warning. We're not going to get into any sort of nitty-gritty details or anything, but we are talking about sex, and it is sensitive, and I know there's a huge range. Myself, I have 3 young kids from 7 to 13, so trying to balance that between every person and what their expectations are and what they share with their kids. I just want you to all be prepared for that. All right, so those are going to be kind of the sections and parts that we go through. But first, I want to go through and define what kind of a biblical model of sex is. And I'm guessing, at least with most people in the audience here or watching online, I probably don't have to argue too much about what the Bible says about sex, but I think it's important to go through those verses and understand just very basic and simple, because sometimes when I talk on this subject, people think that I'm not trying to uphold the biblical view of sex, that I'm trying to change something or influence people's theology to maybe in a different direction, and that's not what I'm doing. Again, so I just want to have that disclaimer, particularly for this first part, because when we talk about biological sex, we're not really getting into things that are debatable. It's very straightforward, simple, like here's what we observe genetically, and we have, there isn't much to say about that. The second part is more going to be, here's kind of the research, what it says, but there could be these other factors that aren't considered or different things in it. So it's a little more controversial or debatable, but not a whole lot. So that's just kind of a broad overview about what we're going to talk about. And we do have Q&A at the end, but we're going to do between what you see there on the slides, part 1 and 2, we're going to do Q&A there because it's kind of a shift in topics. So with that, we'll get started and talk about the biblical view of sex. And in simple terms, sex is good. God created sex. He wants us to have sex. Our species depends on it. Not all other species. All species that reproduce sexually depend on it because there are asexually reproducing species, right? So the book, Song of Solomon, right? A whole book, and again, some scholars will say it's not necessarily about sex, but others say it is, right? About the goodness of sex. It's funny, my daughter, my kids, we do with them, they have to read a Bible verse a day, or chapter, sorry, not a verse, a chapter, and usually they will work through a book, or they will let them watch like the Bible Project or something online. And one day my daughter decided to play just a little bit of Bible roulette, and so she opened up the Bible and just read a chapter. And so later when I asked her what she read, she got a little embarrassed and was like, it was a little weird. I was like, well, what book was it from? And it was from Song of Solomon. So a little fair warning when you have your kids read the Bible is there are some things that maybe they don't want to read or might be embarrassed about, but that we shouldn't necessarily hide from, okay? So moving along through the Bible, 1 Corinthians 7:3, so talks about in marriage, right? We should fulfill each other's sexual needs. And then Proverbs 5:18 and 19 here, maybe one of the most direct verses about the goodness of sex, where it's, saying, rejoice with your wife, let her breast fill you with delight. So happiness and goodness, like sex is good. We should enjoy it and thank God for it. Okay, and here what I'm talking about, again, not biological sex, but sexual intercourse. However, we do want to be clear that all good things can have limits to their goodness, right? You can take any action, say driving a car, right? Driving a car, it gets us places, it's good, but when you drive recklessly or say in places you're not supposed to, you go off-roading through a playground or something, that would be bad. And sex is no different, right? So it's a good thing, it's designed to be good for our enjoyment, but there are wrong ways to go about it, okay? And so, again, back in Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 6:18 says, flee from sexual immorality. Ephesians 5:13, among you there must not be a hint of sexual immorality. Okay, so sex is good, but don't be sexually immoral. But what is sexual immorality? And that's kind of an important question we need to answer. Okay, so typically when the Bible talks about sexual immorality, it's coming from this word porneia. That's the Greek word porneia. It's where we get our word pornography from, okay? And it's a very broad term. So Greek and in Hebrew, if you study those languages, the biblical languages, words are often a lot more flexible than they are in our language. And so we have, several words that can mean different things, sometimes contradictory things, right? If I say, oh, that's sick, right? You hear that from a teenager, that means that's awesome and it's good, right? But you hear that from an adult or maybe in a different context and it means what we think, right? It's sick, it makes me disgusted and I don't like it, okay? Well, Greek and Hebrew, no different, except words often have greater flexibility. And so porneia can mean lots of different things. It's kind of a broad blanket statement for sexual immorality, but Perhaps the simplest way to understand porneia, or when the Bible talks about sexual immorality, is all sexual activity with another person or animal, which is sad that we have to make that clarification, but that was, as weird as we think sometimes our culture is sexually, first century Rome and other cultures throughout history have been as bad, if not worse, than our culture. So we have to always keep that in mind. Doing biblical interpretation is what the original audience would have thought. So all sexual activity with another person or animal outside of non-incestual heterosexual marriage. It's kind of a mouthful. Non-incestual, so does that mean brother, sister, cousins? Again, there's different cultural norms and standards among this. So the typical American kind of view of this would be, siblings, parents, first cousins, second cousins. That would kind of fall under the umbrella of incest. So anything outside that, and again, then the heterosexual marriage as well. So just making clear that delineation, because that's sometimes where, when we go into this talking about biological sex, some people will start to feel a little uneasy because they might think that what we talk about might be in support of homosexual marriage or something along those lines, or when we get into discussing kind of transgender views, that's where they go immediately. And what we talk about here in a minute should help inform your views on that, but I don't think whatever your view is now that it should radically probably change your views on that, if that makes sense. All right. So another thing that's important, and again, this is coming from my background in psychology, is as this is a very sensitive topic, one of the most important things I think to keep in mind, so we have our content, right? But we also have the way we talk about our content. And so we always want to keep in mind how we talk to others and interact with other people, whether we're engaging in apologetics and evangelism, or we're just having a conversation, especially with holidays coming up. We just had Thanksgiving, and I know a lot of people aren't going home this year or going and visiting with families, but there's still a lot of people doing that. And now with Christmas and New Year's still, a lot of people you're going to be interacting with family, some of who very much disagree with us. And so we always want to keep in mind, how do we engage and interact with others? So 1 Corinthians 5, 9 through 10, I put the text in small print there just because the basic gist here is that we should not expect unbelievers to follow a biblical view of morality. So we shouldn't be surprised by that. But at the same time, we shouldn't cast them out and not interact with them like we would with a believer who is acting immorally. Does that make sense? And so keeping that in mind of who we're engaging with and what their standards are and what we expect is really important. And then Colossians 4:6, let your speech always be seasoned with salt. So again, always be careful of your words and speak kindly and respectfully to the others. And 1 Peter 3:15, that's the big apologetic verse, right? Always be prepared to give an apologetic or a defense. And we often hear, those of us who do apologetics, we use that verse all the time and we hear it all the time, but often people forget the last part of that verse. And it's, but do so with gentleness and respect. So we always want to keep the person in mind and how we're interacting with them and be kind and respectful and in the way that we do that. And so this is probably going to feel like me beating a dead horse here, because this is going to come up, this topic again of how we engage with others. But I do think it's very important and equally as important as the content, whether we're talking about sex or we're talking about any other apologetic issue. We always have to keep in mind how we engage with others. And that's a whole nother presentation on the science of persuasion and things like that. That would be interesting to go through sometime as well. So I'll keep that in mind and give myself a little plug for the future. So John, write that down. Okay. So I don't want you to read that. So this next one, if you have, we're going to watch a short video. It comes from the show Brain Games, if you've ever played that. But the exercise they're doing in this comes from a peer-reviewed study. So we'll talk about that. So just sit back, we're going to watch this quick 5-minute video clip.
Pay attention along with them as the crew gets the final shot of the movie. Try to remember what you see.
Here we go. Final shot, everyone. Action!
Keep watching. Everything you see is fair game.
What got into the car? Cut!
Okay, that wasn't part of the movie. Did you catch what just happened? I know, it was a lot to take in. But we're going to let you in on a little secret. The actors, director, crew, and police are all in on it. Everyone, in fact, except our spectators. And former Las Vegas Police Sergeant Chris Curtis is here to test your memory. He's going to ask you and our other witnesses 3 questions about what you just saw. Ready?
What color was the car that got hit?
Think back and try to be accurate. Got your answer?
Did you say blue? Good, that's correct. Next question. How fast do you think the car was going when it bumped into the other car?
What do you think? Was the red car going 10, 15, 20, 30, or 40 miles an hour? Got your answer? Did you guess around 20 miles an hour? If so, you agree with 80% of people we showed this video to. Before we reveal if you're correct or not, let's see what our spectators have to say.
How fast would you say the car was going when it smashed into the other car?
I'd say 40.
Between 40 and 50.
It was going about 30 miles an hour.
Definitely 50 miles an hour.
These people think the speed was really high. Is that what you thought? Or did you think it was much lower? It turns out the actual speed was 20 miles an hour. Is that what you guessed? So why were our eyewitnesses so much higher? The thing is, only some of our witnesses guessed high. Others were much closer to the real speed.
How fast do you think the car was going when it bumped into the other car?
Probably about 10, 15 miles per hour.
15 miles per hour.
15 miles an hour?
Yeah.
Okay, how can this guy think it's 50
Between 40 and 50.
and this guy think it's 15?
15 miles per hour.
After all, they both saw the same crash. But if you've been paying attention, you'd know it's not the crash that matters, it's the question. Listen carefully to Sergeant Curtis.
How fast would you say the car was going when it smashed into the other car? How fast do you think the car was going when it bumped the other car?
Did you catch it? He said smashed. To some witnesses,
Smashed into the other car, smashed into the other car, smashed into the other car.
and bumped to others, including you.
When it bumped the other car.
The word smashed actually increased the speed of the red car in our spectators' memory.
So I want to tell you, the actual speed of the accident was 20 miles an hour.
I don't believe that. That's crazy.
Yeah, that would surprise me.
It seemed like it was 30 miles an hour.
You're kidding, right?
That's a big difference.
It's incredible if you think about it.
The study that comes from Elizabeth Loftus, and I believe it's John Palmer, but I'm not sure on his first name. So classic study in memory from a while ago. And the importance of this, and the reason I show this and use this as an example, again, to beat that drum, our words matter. And the way we talk to people, both the words that we choose and the way that we say those words can really impact the way that people view us and our message. And so when we are talking about sex, gender, sexual intercourse, whatever it may be, and we can go to politics or whatever, when we are talking to someone and using that as an apologetic and trying to persuade someone, all those little things matter. And when we are the outgroup, when we are different than them, and they have these drastically different views of us, and so you talk to an unbeliever, an atheist, and you tell them what we're going to talk about sex, and they're going to say, well, I don't believe it. And I actually gave the second half of this presentation, I gave it to a Ratio Christi chapter, and there was an atheist there in the audience who said, I don't believe the science. I think you should have sex before marriage to try it out. I think that's better. he was an engineering student, a graduate student in engineering, and he's like, I don't care what the science says, I just think this makes more sense to me. And so people are going to push back even when you have scientific evidence. And so, again, the way that you present it, how you speak to them, your willingness to listen, all of this matters. Our words matter. And again, I just want to really make this clear because it is really important. And part of what we're going to do here and how we're going to start
Pay
is
attention
actually
along with them.
talking about words. So again, more Bible verses just on this, on the words, the power of words and the power of language. You can write those down if you want, but again, words matter. And so doing that, we're going to skip around here. Some terminology, because this is really important in this discussion. Often when you're talking about biological sex or gender, terms matter. And so we'll often use, and again, assuming most of us are what would be considered normal, and I use that in quotes and say that intentionally, is if you are or know someone who is kind of in the minority, a sexual minority, that word normal to them is a negative word. It has a negative connotation because you're saying there's something wrong with them. And maybe, I don't know if you think there's something wrong with them or not. That's, again, second to the debate, because some of this people don't have any choice in, right, even on how they act, right? Normal is a really strong word. So a better word than normal might be to say more common or something of that sort. Again, same if you talk about the issue of homosexuality or the issue of transgenderism, that word issue automatically tells someone who disagrees with you that their view is wrong and problematic. And so using the word topic instead is often a better choice of words. And so just keeping that in mind, I think is really important so that we can use words most effectively and also not intentionally offend or harm people when we have these discussions. And so what we're mostly going to be talking about in this first section is called intersex. So, or the other word is sometimes disorder of sexual development, but again, sometimes that has a negative connotation to it as well by people who have an intersex condition. So typically I'll use the word intersex, although it is a broad word and some of these technically don't fit into what is considered intersex, but it still often is used to cover those. And some of the, most of us in here, maybe watching online, might be familiar with the term hermaphrodite, and that might be more what we think of, but that word also is one of those that has, for people with an intersex condition, a negative connotation, and so it's viewed as offensive. So I would want to encourage you, hopefully not to use that term anymore, and transition to using the word intersex. And so let me then go back here a second and say, well, what is intersex? So let's talk about biological sex. Very broad overview of genetics, right? So as humans, we have 46 chromosomes that are put together into 23 pairs. And on that 23rd pair, you see we have our sex chromosomes. These are the chromosomes that determine our biological sex, whether we are male or female. And males have an XY chromosome. You can see, can you all out there, you can see slides, right? Okay. So you see you've got the XY chromosomes that are put together, or you get females who are XX. That's the most common arrangement for sex chromosomes. And when I say most common, the instances that we're going to talk about here of intersex conditions, the statistics vary a little bit on how often this is, and part of the issue is that it's not always known. Right? So some people with intersex conditions will go their whole life and never know it. So how do you find out if they have it if they themselves don't even know it? So you have to do kind of random genetic testing and things. But it's estimated about 1.7% of the population has one of these intersex conditions that we are going to talk about, which may not seem like a lot, okay? But I'm guessing most people here go to a church of at least 100 people, give or take. So if you go to a church with 100 people, you're looking at 1 to 2 people in that church might have something that we're going to talk about today. Or if you say go to a mega church, let's say 3,000 people, right? So now you're looking at 30 or so people to 60 in that church who might have that. And again, some people may not even know it. So while it is a small minority of people, they're still people and they matter. And oftentimes those people are going to feel really out of place at a church and are going to be fearful even of church, and that often people aren't even going to, what we're going to talk about, are going to have no idea about the things we're going to talk about here. And actually on my website, I wrote kind of this out, all this stuff, this information here, just to get it out there. And what I titled it is What You Don't Know About Biological Sex, because most people really don't know about it. And it shows in the way that many people, not all people, but many people talk when they talk about homosexuality and gender and debate those topics, okay? So let's move into the different variations on the sex chromosome. So again, we talked about having the XX for female, XY is male, but there are sometimes where there's a variation in that. So the first one, known as Turner syndrome, okay, this is about 1 in 5,000 girls. And I say girls, that's how most people with this would identify, because what they have is they have on their sex chromosome, it's either just in one X chromosome, so they're missing that second pair, or that that second copy is a shortened copy. So I have it here. If you see, it's kind of like an XO, so it's X chromosome and then no other attached on the pair. Okay, and so you might be reading this and think, well, okay, they look like a female, they have female parts, but they identify, well, clearly that would be female, right? The problem is how many X chromosomes, and problem is maybe the wrong word, but how many X chromosomes do females have in the most common arrangement? They have 2. Males have 1. And so now people with Turner syndrome, they are in the category of having 1 X chromosome. So you can say, well, yeah, they're female because they only have X chromosomes, like the more traditional variation for X chromosomes, but they don't always feel that way. Okay, so again, an important thing to think about and just be sensitive to that someone might have this. And so how does this affect people? So some people with Turner syndromes may show absolutely no signs, so you can't tell. Others might have some different physical signs that they have it, such as like a widened neck or low set ears, or maybe some heart abnormalities which you couldn't see. So how this affects people varies for sure. The next one, triple X syndrome, and this is where people will have 3 X chromosomes, and this is about 1 in 1,000, so a little more common than Turner syndrome. But typically you have people with this will have really no symptoms. Actually, one of the more common ones is that girls with this variation are at higher risk for behavioral problems or learning disabilities, so something like ADHD, perhaps having increased risk of other mental health problems, or even physical problems such as seizures or flat feet. So little different on the symptoms, but again, often no signs that someone might have this. And so someone could have this condition and have no clue and go their whole life living and never even know it. The next one, now this gets what, and pardon my words here, but this gets what I think most people would consider a little more weird or strange. And I say this just simply because this is something most people are completely unaware of as even a possibility. Okay, and this, so an XX male, or XX male syndrome. And what happens here, so again, we talked about the typical arrangement for the sex chromosomes. XX would be females. So you have XX chromosomes, you're born, you look, and you're female in every way that we traditionally think about female. But there are some people, and again, it's about 1 in 20,000, so it's pretty rare, okay? But they will have the XX chromosomes, and when they're born, they will look male. And as far as any signs that we know, they are male. They have a penis, right? As they age and develop, they will have male characteristics. And so again, in every way, they look and appear male. There was no choice made at their birth by their parents to assign them a new gender or to have surgery for ambiguous genitalia, which is sometimes a sign of some of these different conditions. None of that. They look completely 100% male, even though they have XX chromosomes. And the reason is because what happens in utero with the hormones, the balance is different than what is typically experienced. And so that will transition instead of forming in the sex organs, forming into ovaries and vagina and clitoris, right? They will form into a penis and testes. So the symptom or signs of this, so typically a male with this will be shorter in stature, but not always. And then I don't know if they're always infertile, but typically I think they're going to be infertile, so they won't be able to have kids. So, and that'll be often how people will discover some of these different conditions with intersex conditions, is that, you know, in adulthood they'll find out they're infertile and they'll want to know why, and so they'll go through all kinds of testing, and genetic testing usually isn't the first, and but after several rounds they'll discover something like this. So again, not something people really notice. Sometimes they will, sometimes they'll have ambiguous genitalia or undescended testes, so there might be some signs, but it's not always known that it's going to be because of their genes. And again, this is rare, 1 in 20,000 people, so it's not like it's something doctors are seeing every day, or even a doctor might see ever in their lifetime as they deliver babies or something. And then on the flip side, you have kind of the opposite, where now you have XY, Swyer syndrome, an XY configuration in the genes, but then the baby presents as a girl. I lost my spot here on my slides. And so this is even more rare. It's about 1 in 80,000, but again, kind of same thing. The XY genes, so what is typically male genes, but the baby is born, and there can be a range. It can look completely 100% female, or they may be something where they have ambiguous genitalia or something like that. The difference, though, is people that have this often can go through, they'll find out because they won't go through puberty, or they'll never get a period as a female, which they can eventually do through hormone therapy. But the other thing with this is they can actually become pregnant. So you have people, XY chromosomes, who are female, and all they know is being female in every way, but they can actually get pregnant. But and I say that with a caveat, because they cannot, I don't think they have eggs, because they don't have ovaries usually, but they can do it through implantation. So they can have a fetus implanted in them, and then they can have the baby that way, so through different in vitro processes. And then the last one on this slide, Klinefelter syndrome. Okay, and so this is XXY. So now thinking here, you have XX, which is traditionally female, and then XY, which is more commonly male. So again, which would someone identify with in this case? And so this one's a little more common. This is about 1 in 650 newborn boys, and I say boys because people born with this will typically present and look and feel like males on boys. And so with this, it's estimated that as many as 75% of people will never actually know. So again, this is, I think, the most common out of any of these conditions we talk about. But now, most of them, the vast majority, never know that they'll actually have it. Okay? And with this, you often get people who are actually often taller, but at the same time, they'll often have decreased testosterone, delayed puberties, and sometimes even like secondary sex characteristics that look more female. So for instance, enlarged breasts. And so there can be other related effects, and then perhaps the most common, about 10% of them will have autism. Okay, so you just point being, so these are the most common ones, and these different genetic configurations are things that we don't typically see or think or hear about or talk about when we hear discussions about homosexuality or transgenderism or different views on gender or whatever the case may be, but they're important to discuss. But that's not it. There's more. So we'll go through these more briefly because these, again, are less, they're less common, so they're not happening as often. Although the first one here, the XYY, sometimes called Jacob's syndrome, is about 1 in 1,000 boys. So this one is one of the more common ones. So again, typically taller than the average male, but sometimes they'll have things such as enlarged head or teeth, or they may have no side effects at all. So, and like the Klinefelter syndrome, also increased risk of autism or like ADHD or something like that. And then we have XXYY. So again, remember, typically you have 2 chromosomes that come together to make a pair. Here we have 4, so 2 of each. Okay, and this is variations range for this one between 1 in 18,000 and 1 in 40,000. So pretty rare. But what is interesting with this is the average height of someone with this is 6 feet 4 inches. So one of the main side effects of having this genetic configuration is increased height. But sometimes you'll also have some other signs of this, such as breast enlargement or decreased testosterone or even reduced body hair. The next one, XXXY, so again, tend to be taller. Is about 1 in 17,000 to 50,000, so estimates on this range a lot. Usually infertile, and sometimes we'll have some intellectual disabilities. The next one, where were we? XXXY, so just make sure I said that right, 4 X's and a Y. Extremely rare, 1 in 90,000 newborn boys. So it's very rare, and all known people with this are infertile. And then the last one, extremely rare. There's only one known case, at least that I saw in any of the research of this. So it's kind of more of something that theoretically can happen, and we know it can in some cases, but same kind of symptoms we talked about, but usually much more advanced. So a little more, at least because there's only one known case, so it's hard to say, well, this is always going to be the case. And so that kind of covers the different genetic variations. These next ones here are some, like, it's overlapping kind of terminology. So if someone has an intersex condition, they may have clitoromegaly, which is an enlarged clitoris. And so this goes back to, so some babies, and it could be a baby with an intersex condition or not, are born with ambiguous genitalia. And so it's not clear, or completely clear, at least to the doctors when the baby is born, that the penis is a penis or if it's an enlarged clitoris. And so there's actually a scale doctors use, which has kind of gone out of fashion, but often used to determine what range the baby falls into and how gender should be assigned at birth for that baby, because the thought being that it would be better for the baby for the parents to essentially choose a gender for this baby now based on the size of the genitalia, and raise that child based on those kind of gender stereotypes or whatever that might be. So this is a common thing. It's a pretty common thing to see with some of these intersex conditions, so such as the XX males or XY females, but it can apply to lots of different genetic configurations, even what is considered kind of the common ones. And then the other is congenital adrenal hyperplasia, Okay, and this is basically something that affects males and females, but females usually have more extreme or severe symptoms. And essentially what this is it affects the production of different sex hormones, the main one being androgen. So androgen being female sex hormone, or male sex hormone, sorry. And so when it affects that, it can affect the way that primary and secondary sex characteristics develop. So primary sex characteristics, I kind of already talked around this a little bit, but primary sex characteristics would be those that are necessary for sexual reproduction. So penis, testes, versus ovaries and vagina, things like that. And then secondary ones would be those things that are more typically associated with different biological sex. So breast size, voice, facial hair, those types of things, okay? The next one is androgen insensitivity syndrome. So this is kind of in the opposite direction, where it's affecting people, but where there's an insensitivity to androgen, or at least partial. So again, continuum, you can have extremely severe to less severe, so there may or may not be symptoms, but typically you'll get with this, people appear, at least when they appear male, they'll usually be infertile and have enlarged breasts. And then the last one, 5-alpha reductase deficiency, similar to what we just talked about, but instead of an insensitivity to androgen, it's an insensitivity to dihydrogen testosterone, which I don't know how that's different than just testosterone, because this is a little beyond my research, is more on the biological side rather than the psychological side. But this is, so people born with this often have female genitalia at birth and are raised females. However, sometimes they will have ambiguous genitalia or a small penis. And then during puberty, increases in male hormones often gives the appearance of more male-like secondary sex characteristics for those raised females. And then for those raised as males, they'll likely have decreased body and facial hair and will likely be infertile, okay? So that kind of, again, very quickly goes through some different intersex conditions and what people experience. And so now in doing that, we talked about this as we went through, all right? What are the effects of this? So the common ones that we see, sometimes ambiguous genitalia, physical characteristics such as, height, weight, facial features, but also secondary sex characteristics, infertility, delayed puberty, sometimes cognitive abilities. So it can be this range of ways that it affects people, but sometimes there's no apparent effects. And that's really important to keep in mind, and now kind of gets more to kind of the apologetic side, right? So when we discuss sexuality and gender, there are people, again, this is probably a little under 2% of the population, who have one of these intersex conditions, who have no signs of it whatsoever. No symptoms, no nothing. And in many cases, they might not know. In some cases, they might know, okay? And yet, we are talking to people that have one of these conditions, often, again, if we are talking about sexuality or gender as a topic, and what is right and what is wrong in those things. And there are people with some of these conditions who it kind of, they're outside what is talked about in this discussion. When people debate what is right and what's wrong, what should be legal, what shouldn't, they're a separate category. What does it mean for a female, an XY female, to be homosexual or transgender? And maybe you can come up with a good answer for that, but that is not something that's typically factored into people's views on these different topics. So really what I'm doing, the reason we talk about this is to think about these things, because then if we move on, you see the last effect, something we haven't talked about, is how it does affect gender and sexuality. Because one study looked at intersex conditions and sexuality, and slightly over 50%, it was 52% of people they, I don't know if they polled them or they actually interviewed them, but from this sample of people with an intersex condition, 52% of them identified as something other than heterosexual. And so what I assume that means is heterosexual would be the sex and gender that they were raised as and that they experienced, but then something then varying from that later in life, if that makes sense. Because again, if someone has ambiguous genitalia or is experiencing something different, it's hard to even really categorize them in some of these ways. So kind of bringing this all together, okay, why this matters, and the reason I think this matters so much is because ultimately we like to have reasons for things. If and I see you in the audience sitting down, if I were to come in and this is a full room and say, hey, do you mind if I have your seat? Okay, probably about half people would say, sure, go ahead. And there would be differences in gender expectations and roles and age, right? But broadly speaking, maybe half or so people would probably say yes. But if I said, hey, can I have your seat? I would like to sit down. So I supply a reason, even though the reason is already embedded in my question. So it doesn't make sense that that would increase compliance, right? But research on that shows that even given a reason like that, that doesn't actually add anything, increases people's willingness to give up their seat, or in other cases, give something, whatever is being asked for. So compliance. So we like to have reasons. We like understanding and knowing things, even if we don't necessarily have to, which is actually also going to be important for the next half of the lecture when I talk about sex, because what the Bible says about sex and what we already talked about, right? We should follow that because we believe the Bible's inspired, and so we should follow the inspired book and what the Bible says. But that's not always enough for people. They want to have reasons why, and knowing that why that would be best. And so those reasons and understanding really help us so that we can love others better and be better representatives of Christ, and be more informed and know and understand his world. And so it really takes away some of the mystery and ambiguity and uncomfortable feelings that we have when we talk about issues or topics broadly, or when we talk to people about sexuality. And so it makes it a little easier for us to do so, and do so in a loving way without coming across as arrogant or condescending or uncaring, which unfortunately is something that many apologists have gained a reputation for. And when I talk to people and meet new people and they find out I do apologetics, very common, the first thing they tell me is how they've had bad experience with apologists because the way that they are talked to by apologists. But we don't have to be that way, and part of that is just simply being more informed. So again, it's not about necessarily trying to change your views or theology on this, but being more informed so that we can speak in a more loving way and maybe with a little more nuance when we have discussions on this topic. So we have, that kind of ends part one. If we have any questions, and I keep this kind of short because of time, but if we have any questions from YouTube, go ahead.
Yes, we have one question. So the question is, we've been hearing about all the percentages of people that vary from the most common, one X, one Y chromosome, or two X chromosomes. How many, what is the percentage of this the most common? So you talked about all the uncommon variations. They add up to what, leaving XY or XX as the most common? Does that make sense?
I think so. So typically males and females are born about the same rate. So you would have, if we're looking 100% of the population, you would have about 48% would be XX female and 48% XY male, and then 49% each. So 49% X female and 49% XY male. And then you would have that last 2% would be one of these different configurations in their sex chromosomes.
Okay, can I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah.
I had always heard that more males were born than females, and you've put the percentages as equal at 49. Is that extra bump for the males because a lot of these uncommon configurations present as male?
I'm not sure on that. I don't know. I was just saying approximately with the numbers, so it might be a little different than that. I'm not sure exactly on that.
Thank you.
I'm trying to think of how common each one is, but I'm not sure. So, yeah, but it's in that range. So you're looking, again, approximately half the population born genetically, socially, everything that would present typically male, and then half where it's same kind of female, and then just that 2% kind of where it's something different than what is most common.
Thank you.
Yep. Yes, John.
So, this may fit in here. You may address this in a little bit. You know, in the past, before we learned about genetics, a lot of people just assumed that all behavior was a matter of choice, and that some people were really different because they chose to be different. But as we've learned about genetics, we have learned that more and more people are biologically or genetically driven towards certain inclinations or behaviors, okay? So, and I'm trying to choose my words carefully here, all right? So, at present, it seems like the narrative that you hear in today's culture is that everything is genetically driven. You're born that way. You have no choice in the matter. You have no choice in your behavior or what you want. You're just strictly born that way. Now, personally, and this is where I want you to maybe correct it or endorse it. Just tell me what you believe the current science is at this time. I have felt like there are degrees of drivenness, if you will, that you do have some people that have a very strong genetic or biological determination and the way that they behave or what they're inclined to do, think, and so forth. But that you also have other people at the other end of the spectrum that really don't have any, but they choose certain behaviors. And so things like sexual behavior itself, some people really are, quote, born with that specific drive, if you will, while other people, it really does, I would think, actually choose that lifestyle for one reason or another. Sort of the sliding scale between nature and nurture, right? Between what you're biologically, the way you're born, and then the way that you grow up and make choices as you live. So it's a long entry into how do you feel like the sciences are coming down in that, in those two extremes, if you will?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So just kind of make sure I'm understanding is kind of getting at the degree to which there might be biological determinism versus choice versus also other factors that might influence people.
Sure.
Is that okay? So from a psychological perspective, we look at everything from a biopsychosocial model. It's kind of so when we get effect sizes and we look at how much of something we can explain. So we can explain, 30% of the variation in scores in intelligence or sexual preference or personality, whatever. 30% for us, that's like huge, that's really big. So we're looking at all these different factors and trying to balance, well, okay, what role did genes play? What role did parenting play? What role did attachment play? What role did friends play? What role did traumatic events play? Right? So we're looking at all these different factors, and it's really hard to tease them apart and pull them apart and figure out what exactly is working with who and even how it's working. And so even if we can determine that kind of at a group level, if we could ever come up with kind of a perfect model that could explain everything, which we will never be able to do because there's just so many factors, we can never apply that to an individual and say, well, this is exactly how you feel or why you're acting this way, because even within a person, there is different variation. With some people will have a much bigger impact from their biology than other people who will have a stronger effect from psychological factors. And so with what I just talked about and talking about the genetic configurations, what I talked about there, none of that is a choice. It's not a choice that let's say you have XX chromosomes, but you present as a male. None of that is choice, right? So we're just kind of laying the groundwork for what might be happening kind of biologically, because then once you start getting to then kind of the moral realm where you're going to say, well, this is how you are, but here is what is right to feel or right to act on, that's kind of a different level. That's more of a philosophical discussion. But I do think it's important to understand kind of the base of what might be potentially influencing people to what desires they do have, and then the degree to what your likelihood that they will act on those desires or could possibly change those desires. And again, a lot of that is going to depend on social, other biological factors, and parenting, and those different things. Does that?
Sure. So
Yeah.
just as a follow-up, is it fair to say that it's just too simple to say that someone was born that way? That really at the end of the day there is a genetic inclination, but you also have nurture that has been involved to a person behaving a certain way, but then you also have choice. So, to say that someone's born that way is just simply say that they have this genetics and they're acting that way. It's almost a completely deterministic behavior. But is it more accurate to say, well, it's not that simple, but you do have the genetic inclination, but you also have the nurturing, how someone was raised, and then somewhere in between there you do have some choice.
Right, yeah. So if we're talking about someone feeling as a certain gender or identifying as like in a certain way sexually, and we could apply this to heterosexuals or homosexuals, we would say, yeah, you are born that way would be a simplification. So it would be more accurate to say, yes, also culture and all these other factors play a role. But if we are going to say born that way and just focus on that part, again, that would be more probably the genetic factors are more likely to influence more your predispositions and so your desires. And so that would be separate than on whether or not you would say it is morally right or good or acceptable for someone to act on those desires, or even in some cases. So I know some people who identify as homosexuals will say they don't want to feel that, right? And so that biological disposition may affect whether or not they could change, or, and again, I'm not saying change necessarily a complete 180, but even to shift their preferences, right, is going to be related certainly to their biology. So, Amy, did you have?
Yes, have a question from, have a question from online here. It says, someone asked, how do these percentages of uncommon X and Y populations change across the world, like developed versus undeveloped nations, poverty issues, environmental factors affecting baby development and mutations, level of health care for our population, et cetera, et cetera?
That is a wonderful question, but that is way too advanced for any the research and even beyond what some of the research exists out there, because again, often when you do scientific research, you are doing this with a random variation of people. So the ultimate goal when we do science is to get a random population. And so if you're doing this and you're randomly selecting, say, 200 people, right? Out of that 200, if only 2% have an intersex condition, that leaves you with 4 people. So now you don't have enough statistical power to draw any conclusions from 4 people. So you have to selectively try to find those people, or you have to get thousands. And so this is really hard. And so, so it's a combination of, one, there's just pretty limited scientific research on some of that. because it does, especially with the depth of that question, there gets to be a lot of questions where you need really large populations. So that's part of it, because I have looked into and researched it a little bit, but then the second part is that it is a little beyond my area of expertise, so I haven't delved into that to that kind of depth yet. So it's a combination of both not being able to go there yet and having the time to do that, but also some of that's not even there in the first place. And then one more question, and then we'll move to kind of the next part.
Okay, this is kind of a follow-up, maybe a two-part question. We've talked about nature, nurture, and choice, but there is a way that you can actually go in and have yourself tested to determine what XY chromosome situation you have physically. So if you could maybe talk a second about what that test is. The second thing is, what causes these very genetic assortments that give you the uncommon X and Y conditions or combinations?
Okay, yeah, so another set of good questions. So just the first one, so how can you get tested for this, right? So I'm not sure the different methods. I know if you're going in and where a lot of people discover they have one of these conditions is because they'll have like delayed onset puberty, and so maybe they'll go through a round of testing with doctors in adolescence, or as adults they're infertile, and so again they'll go through a round of testing, they can't figure anything out, and so a doctor may order like a genetic test. And I don't know if you do like 23andMe, I'm not sure if they would, something like that would identify one of these genetic configurations or not. I don't know if they get into that level of detail when they do it, because again, I do know a lot of this, it just goes unnoticed because that's not often, the first line of defense when, say, you're infertile and a couple comes in and they're trying to have a baby. It's the rounds, okay, well, let's test sperm counts and let's see, if you're producing eggs, or like there's a lot of different ways that they're going to try and solve that problem. So that's why a lot of people will not know. But the other part, and especially as genetic testing gets more common and it's cheaper and easier for us to do, you'll often hear people say, well, it ultimately doesn't matter. Right? Someone with an intersex condition is that, well, it doesn't matter what my genes are. It's none of anyone else's business. So that, again, gets into another issue, because when you talk about, how the church should respond or how government should make laws, maybe it does matter, but maybe it doesn't. And what bounds do we have? So this is kind of a separate theological thing to say, well, what are the limits on the ways in which we make laws or treat people who believe different than us in a society that's not, a theocracy, so to speak. So it gets into a lot of different theological kind of things within just the testing part. And sorry, can you remind me, what was the second part?
What causes the uncommon?
Okay, so causes. So I don't know if there's any known specific causes or not, because any time that we reproduce, there's going to always be genetic variation. So this is just going to be part of that typical genetic variation, and that's kind of why we have two chromosomes. It's kind of like a backup system when there are mutations. And again, from an evolutionary perspective, mutations, right? These random mutations caused by chance or radiation or whatever is what is the kind of the engine that has driven evolution. So it can be any kind of number of things that might be the cause, because again, we have 3 billion base pairs in our genes, so to copy that perfectly would be amazing. But so we have all kinds of different diseases and disorders and things that come from these just random variations in genes when we reproduce, and this, what we talked about, is just happens to be on the sex chromosomes that affect people. All right, so that kind of concludes part one and kind of the biological sex. So now we'll move into testing sex. So now talking about sexual intercourse and the biblical model for how we should engage in sex. And I kind of put it in this terms of testing sex because we kind of want to approach this kind of like a scientific hypothesis. So you say, well, here are the different, why does the Bible say what it does about sex? And from a skeptic's point of view, and it may seem a little crude, but a non-Christian is going to say, well, the Bible says this about sex because it's just an old, stupid book. And maybe they don't say it in exactly those terms, but I've often heard it in very close, sometimes more derogatory terms than that, right? The Bible's old, they didn't know what they were talking about, it's just made up, it's a product of its culture, okay? So that would be one potential hypothesis, and so we want to put this to the test. Is that the case? Or did the Bible give its guidelines for sex because that is what our designer said what is best for us? So kind of like a car manual. User's manual for a car tells you, hey, here's how best to treat your car. Here's when you should get maintenance and do this and that. And if you follow these guidelines, it's going to lead to better outcomes than if you don't. And so that's kind of what we're looking at with this part of the talk, is to test sex as kind of a scientific hypothesis and put the biblical model against other models. And so you say, well, what are those potential other models that we're going to compare it to? Okay? And so one would be kind of just promiscuity. Say, hey, like, we're all just evolved apes, so, let's just go like bonobos and go and have sex with whoever, whenever, wherever, and just enjoy it for fun, right? So that would be a potential model. And in a lot of other societies, especially first century Rome, it wasn't too far from that. So where the New Testament was written, and even ancient Near East, although that would be more of a polygamous model, these were the most common models. And even throughout much of the world now, the monogamy view, the Christian view of sex, isn't necessarily the norm. So these would be different options. Polygamy, we're all familiar with that, I think. So that would be a male who marries, has multiple wives. But polyandry, very rare, but does happen occasionally in some different cultures, and that's where you would have one female who has several husbands. But another potential configuration would be serial monogamy, so kind of like some birds or penguins do. If you've ever seen March of the Penguins, right? You have a mate for one season, you go through and rear a kid or maybe two with that mate, and then you move on maybe to another mate, or like a retirement spouse, someone that, who maybe isn't as good for rearing children, but might be kind of have better interests, right? That more align with yours and what you want to do in retirement. So these are potential options. And then the other one would be monogamy, kind of the biblical model, which we already talked about. Which one of these would be best for human flourishing? And that is kind of an underlying assumption we have here, is that if we believe the Bible was inspired by an all-good and all-knowing God, then it seems extremely likely that the moral guidelines that he gives us are going to lead to, as far as we can tell, the best outcomes, right? And so that's what we're looking at here, is this biblical model of sex. We expect that it would lead to better outcomes than other models of sex, okay? So we're gonna start this, we're gonna do this, we're gonna do another activity, so a little bit of fun here. All right, so when I go to the next slide, after this one, so just go ahead and read it out loud. You can do it all together, but again, you don't have to put any thought into it, just read the slide. Okay, ABC. Now if we do it again, right, 12, 13, 14, so we can go back and forth, right, and you see that B/13 doesn't change, but the context around it kind of dictated what you saw. And we put them side by side, we see the same thing, right? So context matters. Oh, sorry. So a couple more here. If we look at this, oh, it didn't work. I don't think there's a way to fix that. That's my fault. So if you've ever seen the picture of like a chess checkerboard with like a cylinder on it and a shadow, that's what this was supposed to be. The previous slide got cut out, but the one on top, A, looks like it's way lighter than the 1B, but when you remove the context, you see that they're the same color. It's just because this drawn in, this imaginary shadow, changes what our perception sees. So that's something probably pretty easy to Google. If you just Google optical illusion chessboard or something, it'll probably pop up. All right. But for this next one, if you look at the lines, which line is longer? Same? Okay, so you're kind of on to me, but which one looks longer? Do they? All right. Top one looks longer, right? But you were right. Okay, when we compare and we look, they're the same. What about this one? Left looks longer? Okay, that's what you're supposed to say. But the right is actually longer. And so what I did here with this one is how I usually do this is because I go through these series of optical illusions. And normally, you're right, the left one looks longer, but they're the same. But when you take the right one and make it longer, it looks still shorter or it looks the same. So I kind of mess with the optical illusion to show, again, how context, again, your expectations about what we're doing and the context of the circles here makes an impact, right? And so we see that the right one is actually longer, okay? Let me skip ahead here for a section. So why does this matter? Sorry, did you have a question? Okay, no, okay. Why does this matter, and what's the relevance of these kind of perceptions? So when we talk about sex, there's a lot of bias and misperceptions about sex. And so I grew up, 80s, 90s, and that was kind of when adolescence in our society is kind of at its sexual peak, and everyone, at least we thought, and more so now, but we thought everyone was doing it, and it seemed like kind of everyone was, where numbers have actually come down since then, which is a good thing. But even now, here's some statistics from some fairly recent statistics. So 59% of high school students have not yet had sex. 85% have not had sex before the age of 15, so lowering that age, like freshman, sophomore year. 75% say there's too much pressure to have sex. And 70% said they need more information on sex. And so I think this is really kind of eye-opening in an age where everyone can get, pornography, or there's sexting all over the phones, and youth especially talk about it and they think everyone is doing it. But what we look here and we see, really not everyone is doing it, okay, at least at that young age. And even those who even might be, like, there's still a lot of people that thinks, well, maybe there's too much pressure, or I don't necessarily want to, I just feel like I need to fit in. And the reason this happens, so there's a couple main psychological biases that happen here. One is called the availability heuristic. So those things that are more available to our minds are weight more into our decisions. And so when we hear our friends talking about sex or talking about our friends, meaning like this is typically what we might hear from junior high or high school students. So if you have kids or grandkids, the types of things that they hear and think about. They hear about these people talking about sex, whether they're doing it or they're talking about watching it on videos or whatever, or making up lies about what they did, because kids are prone to do that, right? They feel like everyone is doing it because they hear about it. That's the availability heuristic. And then related is this false consensus effect, and so that's why someone may say, well, everyone's doing it, right? So they think everyone, well, one of my daughters, she said all her friends have smartphones. I said, all of them? It's like, well, not this person or that person. Say, well, that's not all of them. It's like, no, it's still all of them. It's like, no, that's not all. It's almost all, right? So that's kind of the way the teenage mind thinks, but it's the way that adults tend to think too, although these factors might not always be as powerful. And then the other one is the spotlight effect, where we feel like the spotlight's always on us. So if I'm a teenager and I'm not having sex, I feel like everyone is looking at me and judging me for not having sex. But again, what we saw here from the statistics is most of them aren't actually having sex. And these are, again, statistics from youth, but this also applies to adults, because sometimes they see that adults will think, well, I'm not a kid anymore, and sure, the Bible says not to have sex, but I'm divorced, or I'm still single, and so I don't necessarily have to follow that. So I want to, I'm mature enough to engage in premarital sex, or even in some cases, people rationalize extramarital sex in kind of the same way, but that's not the case. And what we're going to talk about here applies in the same way to kids, adolescents, and adults about sex. All right. So very briefly, biology of sex. Some researchers will kind of break it up, and this is a very crude way to do it, but in kind of 3 different motivations kind of systems. So you have your sexual motivation system, which again, often very high early in a relationship. There's a lot of testosterone or estrogen flowing, and people have this high sexual motivation and attraction to their partner who they're dating. And then you get your romantic kind of attraction, which is not that quick, like quite as passionate, but still the romance. Let's spend time together, and I want to spend all my time with you, and you're so great, kind of thing. And then the long-term attachment system, oxytocin and vasopressin. So these are hormones kind of flowing through that affect the way that people view their partner or potential partner. So again, going through dating or someone you meet and who might be a potential spouse. That's what's going on kind of inside our bodies to attract us to this other person and then keep us committed and bonded to that person. Okay, so that's, again, basic biology, is kind of just what happens, not much there. But what are the effects? So when you actually engage in sexual intercourse with this person, with somebody, whether you're dating them or you're married, what's going on? So you have this really strong bond because, again, you get that release when you have that sexual motivation system, right? That is kind of, once you have that, then you engage in sex. You have that long-term attachment that releases that oxytocin and vasopressin. Those are known as the bonding hormones that bond you together and really solidify and make that relationship stronger, and you feel more connected and committed to each other. Sounds great, right? And it is. That's the way we were designed. That's God's intention for sex. The problem is that's not always ideal. If you've been dating somebody for a week, you don't want that high level of bonding and commitment if you don't even know that you're going to marry that person. Does that make sense? So we want to bond and be committed to someone we've made a commitment to marry, and once we've engaged in marriage with them, right, once we've gone through the formal ceremonies and the dating and all that, we want to have that high level of bonding and commitment, but we don't want that with people we don't know, or on the flip side, with several people all at once, right? You go through kind of this roller coaster. Oh, I love you, you're great, let's have sex, and we do that, and then you do it with another person, and you create a couple issues when that happens. So one is when you have that release of the oxytocin and vasopressin that you get from sex. I kind of compare that, and sometimes we'll use an example of a Band-Aid, right? If you put a Band-Aid on, and you pull it off, and then put it back on, it's not as sticky that first time, right? And if you take it off again and put it back on and off and on, right, that stickiness isn't as strong. And so it's similar, not quite to the same degree with this long-term attachment system. So the vasopressin and oxytocin, when that gets released in your body, but with several different people, you're creating these strong emotional bonds with this person, and then when you move on to another person, you're kind of ripping that and going back in, so you kind of desensitize yourself to that bond, and it becomes less effective. And so when you do eventually settle down and get married, you aren't going to have as strong of a bond with them as you would have had you not engaged in sex with other people beforehand. Not to say you can't overcome that or you can't develop that, but it's not going to come quite as quickly or easily if you've had sex with several other partners before, okay? And then the other part is expectations, right? So increased number of partners creates expectations that can really lead to a lot of problems. It may not seem, so sure, I have these sexual expectations of my spouse. That's not a big deal. But think of the power that expectations have in your life. When something goes as you expected them, are you happy or not happy? typically you're happy, right? Hey, that worked out as I expected. Even if you expect something bad to happen, right, because you expect it, right, you know it's going to happen, the reaction is often going to be neutral or very minimal, right, if it's something negative that you expected. Expectations really are kind of underlying and driving all kinds of things in our lives, and our anger and our happiness, all, or in so many ways, come down to our expectations, okay? And so now when we talk about sex, if you imagine you have 10 different sexual partners before you get married, and you have expectations from your partner that you marry about the way that the light should be, or different sexual positions that you prefer, or the frequency of sex, right? Or all these different 100 of different factors, and then you get married and settle down with someone, those expectations that you've developed from these other partners, or even through pornography, come with you into that relationship and are going to have huge consequences in your sexual fulfillment in your marital relationship. And you may be thinking this is often going to relate to men, but it's not just men who are affected either, especially in a culture that's more and more trying to empower women, which is great, but often that's done through ways in encouraging women to act more like men, which includes the ways that men fail through pornography or sexual immorality. And so we see more and more of this affected by women, but even on the other side, women have less trust of their spouse, their male spouse, if they've had more sexual partners in the past. So, I briefly mentioned pornography, but you may be thinking, well, I don't have sex with other people, but I watch pornography. That kind of has these same effects because you're seeing these other people on the screen and you're creating these expectations. And so pornography, I would say, would fall under this same kind of umbrella as having sex with other people, especially we look at, biblically, anyone who lusts after another woman has committed adultery in his heart. And even, the science of pornography is just showing more and more damaging effects, and you have a growing number of secular scientists and academics and professionals who are speaking out about the negative effects of pornography and how bad it is. So when we talk about sex, I would say pornography has as bad, if not even worse, effects on people than just having consensual sex with another people or person, because often pornography will push the bounds of what is kind of socially acceptable and good. But more in a gray area would be masturbation. I know there's different theological views on that. It certainly probably affects people. There is a correlation between masturbation and depression, but it's unsure which is causing which. If there's a causal link there, if there's something else going on. But again, I just follow kind of the biblical mandate that would relate. So are you lusting after another person? Doing that would be probably the minimal criteria. And also just keeping moderation in mind in any views that you have for masturbation. But masturbation doesn't strictly relate to the effects that we see when someone has multiple sexual partners. So to wrap that all up very quickly, essentially what happens, so when we talk about premarital sex or when we give sex education, right, it's like, okay, well, sex will lead to STDs and pregnancy, right? Those are kind of the obvious, and that's why those are at the bottom. But there's so many other effects that we get from sex that we don't think about or we don't often hear about. So people who have fewer sexual partners or wait until they're married to have sex have higher marital satisfaction, they have greater sexual satisfaction, they have lower divorce rates, which then compounds with divorce has very negative effects on children, even when they're tried and mitigated. So that kind of creates this cycle of negative effects, and then other effects such as with increased sexual partners of anxiety and depression, so other mental health effects as well. And then looking broadly at monogamy, Joseph Henrich actually argues in his book, The Weirdest People in the World, talking about weird being in Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic societies, so basically US and Western Europe. monogamy, which came through the church's value of monogamy and its rampant evangelization. He claims that monogamy basically domesticated men, right, and is what led to the foundation so that Western civilization could grow and develop, because you have, so in a polygamous society, you get a huge number of men who never get married, and so what do they often do? They commit crimes, or they kind of waste their lives, where you don't get that in monogamous relationships. You get men investing more in children, so those children can do more and survive better. And so he really argues that it lays a kind of foundation for Western civilization was monogamy. And I think he argues that case pretty convincingly. But that pretty much covers it. If there's any questions, or if we have time for questions. I'll say real quick, if you want resources to learn more, here's just a good place to get started. Theology in the Raw would be, it's a podcast, but Preston Sprinkle is the guy who does that. He is probably the go-to guy if you want to learn about sexuality and gender and church's view on it and how we should interact with that, or people who are different than us. Go ahead, John.
So Jay, thank you very much for this.
Thank you.
It was very educational. Really enjoyed that. I'm sure as we think about that through this week, there will be more questions. We may have to email you some of those.
Yeah, I'd be happy to on email or in the comments on the video too.
Okay. So we talk about biblical standards, and a lot of people refer to biblical standards with certainty. But when you actually go to the Bible, it's not as specific as people lead you to believe. And I've had a question about the age between people. For example, in today's culture, if a 20-year-old had sex with a 12-year-old, that would be illegal. They would be put in prison. It's very much frowned on in society. However, almost 100 years ago, my grandfather, who was 20, married my grandmother, who was 12, and it was very much acceptable at that time. It was very much a part of that culture. Which one of those is the biblical, narrative? And so there seems to be a lot of gray area, and I was wondering if you had a resource or a book that you thought did a really good job of teasing out the biblical position on a lot of these gray areas, if you will.
That's a good question. I'm trying to think of different resources because I'm more prone these days to go strictly to kind of peer-reviewed sources. So a lot of them are putting those together kind of piecemeal. So that makes it difficult. But again, Preston Sprinkle, who does Theology in the Raw, he's really good on this. On the topic of, I guess it's more sexuality and gender. So if you're looking at like homosexuality and transgender topics, that type of stuff, I don't know much if there's a whole lot out there, anything really good on, the biblical model for, say, monogamy. I know that there is a movement by some activists to try to argue that the Bible doesn't really say that we should limit marriage to man and woman, and that homosexual marriage is acceptable. And so they try to do that. And again, I know there's Sean McDowell, he's the son of Josh McDowell, did a debate with one of the authors of one of these books, Matthew Vines. It's a fairly good debate to get kind of your feet wet. So there are people trying to argue from that side to do that. But I don't know of any really good responses in the other direction other than, getting at like a typical, like a high-level commentary on, say, Corinthians or Romans or some of the Old Testament passages and things that talk about sexuality.
That debate with Sean McDowell, is that something that's in print, or is that something you would...
That's
DVD
on YouTube.
Or YouTube?
Yeah, if you YouTube Sean McDowell, Matthew Vines debate, you should be able to find it. Matthew Vines wrote a book kind of and laid out this whole kind of case that the Bible does not prevent homosexual marriage. It does not speak about it. It's talking about promiscuity when it talks about sexual immorality, and this model of monogamous long-term relationship was foreign. Monogamous long-term homosexual relationships was foreign to the biblical writers, and so that's not what they were really arguing against. Yes, question over here.
So you talked a lot about the correlation between this monogamous heterosexual relationship in contrast to polygamy or serial monogamy, and how we tend to see more positive outcomes for that. I was wondering about the rigor of the studies. How do they get rid of the correlation causation problem, and what sort of safeguards do they put in to make sure that this is actually causing it and that it's not, these positive side effects aren't happening because these people tended to grow up in nuclear families that were rich or something? I was just wondering about how you argue against the correlation and causation.
Right. Yeah, so good question. So yeah, anytime we have a correlation, right, correlation does not mean causation, but it might be evidence for it. So we have to tease that apart and look at that. And so a lot of this research, some of it certainly does come from Christian scientists, but a lot of it is coming from non-Christians. So it's not that they're necessarily pushing some sort of biblical view, especially these non-Christians. So Joseph Henrich, for instance, as far as I know, he's an atheist, and he's the one that's arguing that monogamy was kind of this foundation for Western civilization. But as far as what you were getting at, there are ways to tease that apart. And so if you do a study and you're looking at 1,000 different people and the effects of sexual partners on anxiety, right, you can limit that so you can control for socioeconomic status. So you can do this all kind of statistically through like regression models or things like that. And so you're kind of pulling out the effects of socioeconomic status, or you name the number of factors. So other psychological issues, say the effects of depression on anxiety, or body type, or gender, so the effects different on males versus females, which they often are actually. We often see different effects on males and females, and unfortunately there's often worse effects on females in many ways. So yeah, there are lots of different ways to do that, and again, it's kind of a slow progress. And one study will say, okay, here's the claim, here's what we found, and then another one will follow up and say, yeah, we did that, but also we added in this variable and these factors, and we looked at more depth because we thought that might have been an explanation, but we controlled for those, and it's still the effects still hold. And so it is one of those things that say we can never be, at least with what we have now, probably completely sure, because you can also argue that it's just all these factors of culture, being in a culture that's largely monogamous, that if we went to just like an open sex culture where people had sex whenever, wherever, maybe our psychology would change, whether it's through kind of cultural evolution or genetic evolution, and that could maybe be the case. And I certainly think that there would probably be some variation there, but I think it still makes more sense biologically when we talk about the hormones and neurotransmitters, what's happening there when we have sex, that we would have better outcomes through monogamy than other factors. Yeah, over here.
This is a question that was emailed in from someone who knows that you and your wife have your own ministries. They wondered if you'd comment on them.
Sure, yeah, my wife is also an apologist. She works for Mama Bear Apologetics. She's the executive director there, and so they focus on training up parents so that they can train their kids, and so very much trying to appeal to mostly moms, but also dads, and help prepare them to do to strengthen their kids' faith and prepare them for the challenges their kids face, because their kids probably aren't going to hear this from their friends, that monogamy and not having sex in high school is going to be better for them, right? And so part of this talk is like, hey, here's a little bit of evidence for the faith, but here's also something that is going to strengthen your kids. So Mama Bear is a great ministry for doing that, and that's my wife does that, and she also just recently got hired as a children's pastor at our church. And then I do kind of a little more freelance type of apologetic stuff, and just kind of focusing on integrating psychology and apologetics, and mostly through stuff like this or writing on my website. I'm pretty easy to find on social media. Thank you.
Have another viewer question. Can Jay elaborate on the idea that, quote, sex is all in the mind, end quote, meaning that the body responds to whatever the mind is aroused or trained to do?
So I'm guessing that's talking about sexual intercourse. So what the effects are of sexual intercourse. Can you tell from the question?
I can only read it again. Jay, can you elaborate on the idea that sex is all in the mind, meaning that the body responds to whatever the mind is aroused or trained to do?
Okay, so I guess let me just take approaches from both biological sex and gender and then intercourse and say there is probably some degree of, okay, we have this view of, okay, I am a male, so biologically I'm a male, but could I maybe through my mind and my experiences and my culture convince myself that maybe I am really a female? I think maybe that could happen, and I know that, there's it's called rapid onset gender dysphoria. In some cases, again, not all cases, because I can't speak for everyone, but for instance, I talked about Preston Sprinkle, and he just had a guest on who went through basically this process in her teen years where she was a female, and then just between who she was hanging out with and spending time with, she just felt like, now she's a male, and she started going through a transitioning process, and then actually came back, and because she really felt like, at least at the time, a male, and then came back and detransitioned. And so if that's what the question is asking about, I think maybe there are some ways in which that can happen, but I think there's probably also kind of like limits to how that can work. And then the same with if you're talking about sexual intercourse and how it affects us, I don't think we can say, well, I'm going to have sex with this person, but I'm not going to form a bond or attachment with them. And then I can save that so that when I one day get married, that I'll bond and attach to that person through sex. And I know we like to think maybe we have that kind of control. And again, maybe we do to a small degree, but one of the probably clearest things you get from psychology that kind of completely undebated is how there are so many factors that influence us that are below consciousness that we just don't know are affecting us in our decisions. And so I would say that, like, what we're attracted to or who we're attracted to or what the effects of our sex, maybe we can influence that to some degree, especially if it's within cultural norms, because culture has a huge impact on us. But as we maybe try to change or have really strong biological predispositions, there may be some limits to that. So again, I'm not completely sure on the question, but I think definitely I just want to be careful from saying, well, this is just something in the mind either way. And sure, maybe it is in the mind, but that doesn't necessarily mean we can change it, but it doesn't mean that we can't, or that there might not be some area, so where maybe we can change it a little bit to some degree, if that makes sense. So, yeah.
A question that was sent in online, where did your statistics on teens and sex come from?
So I collected that from a variety of different websites and peer-reviewed journals. So if you, and I can maybe post this in the link or send them to John and he can post it in the video, because when I do talk on this, whether it's the first part or the second part of the talk, I want to make sure everything I say comes from a reliable peer-reviewed source. So the simplest way, if you want to get that quick right now, if you go on my website, just jmedenwaldt.com, and you find my articles on these two topics, at the bottom I have quite a few peer-reviewed sources at the bottom in a works cited bibliography thing, so you can pull some of that information there.
Okay, we're going to make, actually, we're two questions, two final questions. We've had really good response from viewers. So the first question, is there really homosexuality in the non-human animal kingdom?
Can you repeat that?
Yes, is there really homosexuality in the non-human animal kingdom? Are there animals who are homosexual?
Yes, there are. So when we hear so I assume that is coming from a Christian perspective. When we hear that claim, it's not something we need to argue against because there is. I'm not sure if it's something that is naturally occurring or the degree to which it's naturally occurring versus when it happens, say, in different captive environments. So that's one factor to consider, and I apologize, I don't know the details on that, especially when you get to different, say, bonobos that are very sexual kind of apes or primates, I guess. I don't know the degree to which, say, they will engage in kind of homosexual activity versus just being promiscuous with the other sex. So I'm not sure about that, but I do know that other animals do engage in homosexual acts. I just don't know the bounds of when that happens, but again, then you would, if we're looking at that and having a discussion about that, that again doesn't necessarily mean that it's therefore morally acceptable and right, because animals also engage in cannibalism and eating their young, so we don't necessarily want to use that as our litmus test of what is right or good, even if we're coming at it from an evolutionary perspective to say we've evolved from that, therefore we should still go to that, because that's not necessarily the case, because what separates us largely from animals is our ability to inhibit some of our initial reactions and desires in order to do, say, the greater good for society or for ourselves or whatever.
Very good. Okay, we'll make this the last question so we can end in a timely fashion. So can you comment on the gift of celibacy, quote unquote, the gift of celibacy from God in dealing with internal sexual desires? This is somewhat related to some denominations/religions demanding that priests and such be celibate.
Yeah, so, and that's, I think, a great question, and thank you for whoever asked that, because it's very easy for us to get caught up in our culture to say, well, you get married, and then you get married, you have kids. And neither of those is necessarily the case, nor necessarily the Christian model. All right? Jesus even says, and Paul reiterates, basically, that says, if you can handle it, not getting married is a better way. And again, if you can handle it, if you were given that gift, and again, even if you're given that gift or opportunity or whatever, that doesn't necessarily mean you won't have struggles either, because even if you're given the gift of a spouse, that doesn't mean you'll never want singleness or always want to be with that spouse. So we need to keep that in mind, and that the church often doesn't do a great job of ministering to single people, whether they're single by choice or not, or wherever they're single, but they are certainly an important part of the church. And some people who are single, and some people who are married, are going to have strong sexual temptations, and some won't. So again, something to keep in mind in how we protect and put up barriers to prevent sexual immorality in our own lives, but in the lives of the people in our church or our small group or whoever we're spending time with. And if that question was geared specifically where I often hear it towards homosexuality, again, so that would be certainly something, especially with the question we asked about the mind. So someone who has same-sex attraction, they might not ever be able to change that. God may choose not to change that for them. They may not want to change that, but regardless of their desires, they do have the option and the choice whether to remain celibate and go into, again, they don't even necessarily have to go into ministry. They don't have to become a priest or a monk in order to live a celibate life, and they can live a productive, what is a typical American life, and still be celibate. And that is a good and a wonderful thing, and so I don't want to ever discount that or let people think that that's can somehow be an unfulfilling option, because it doesn't have to be. In all the fruits and greatness that life offers, they may be missing out on that part of it of sexual intercourse, but they also may have more opportunities to do other things and for other joys and things like that. So I hope that answered the question. That was kind of a lot of talking to make sure I hit maybe what they were getting at, but
very good. Thank you. You want to? Do you have a website you want to promote real quick?
Yeah, so if you just Google me, my name, even if you spell it wrong, which everyone does, and that's okay.
J. Medenwaldt, right?
J. Medenwaldt, but it's M-E-D, not M-E-N. So if you Google me, my website will pop up. Actually, my most popular article is on the Enneagram. So if you've ever heard anything about that, but that'll probably be what pops up first. But that'll get you to my website and anything else that I've written on. I've written on these topics and a lot of other related ones, and how we can just kind of use psychological science to make our apologetics better, or in the case of, say, this sex talk, how we can add, a new argument, maybe not the strongest argument, I'll admit, but a new argument to say, hey, here's another piece of evidence that Christianity is probably true.
Excellent. Jay, thank you very much. Really appreciate you coming.
I appreciate it.